Hey girl, Marissa here. You are listening to the Codependent Dummy podcast. As a young woman, you have been raised, reinforced, and rewarded for putting the needs of others above your own. Now, in your 20s, you're finding yourself exhausted, exasperated, and enveloped in shit relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. Codependency is a way of being where we put the feelings, wants, and needs of others above our own in an unconscious attempt to meet our own feelings, wants, and needs. Sorry to break it to you, sis, but that is not sustainable. This podcast is to help you undo all that so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. Let's get to it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Codependent Dummy podcast. Today, Cori Rosenthal is back.
I'm back.
She's back. Cori is a licensed therapist based out of Southern California. Her training in mindful self-compassion informs her work with teens and adults. She specializes in working with intimacy and codependency, food and body issues, trauma, and anxiety. And she initially came on the podcast. Her original episode aired February 7th, 2021. She was the second guest of all time. So, Cori, thank you for coming back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I can't believe when you said the date, how long ago that actually was.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it has been over 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to hear an updated version of how you conceptualize codependency.
So what I will say is over the last couple of years, I still view it as a result of developmental misses or traumas from, obviously, development means childhood. I will notice, and this is partially because I did an additional training in it, in childhood emotional neglect. So I think when someone experiences abuse, it's more of the obvious, something's gone wrong in the way that I grew up. And it's understandable that I have challenges that may present initially as anxiety and depression.
Mm-hmm.
But childhood emotional neglect, often you don't realize what you didn't get because you didn't know that you were supposed to get it.
Right.
And so, some of my clients that I've noticed this with might be coming from a really affluent family where both parents had big careers and the kids were maybe even raised by a nanny, like their physical needs were met, but emotionally the parents just weren't available.
Right.
And the message that a lot of times those kids will get will be things like, in order for me to have value, I need to do something of value. Or I need to achieve a certain way. And certainly how I look can play a role in that, because so often our culture will reward people who are thin and considered conventionally pretty.
Right.
So that all gets woven in. So I would say the biggest difference is really how much more frequently I am noticing and treating specifically the emotional neglect from childhood and how that really shows up in someone who identifies as codependent or even doesn't identify, but is behaving and living as someone who has codependency issues.
Mm-hmm. And Cori, do you sense that we have all been emotionally neglected? Yeah. Do you sense, or yeah, are there households where parents really get it right?
I think that it goes back to what I learned in graduate school, probably you did too, which is the idea of good enough parenting.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to pick up on and attune to your child 100% of the time.
Right.
But little things like not negating how they're feeling. Like, well, if you think you have it bad, or the line I loved growing up, if you want me to give you something to cry about, or the discomfort that oftentimes adults have with emotions because of how they were raised. So that when the child is expressing emotion, the parents are trying to get them to stop, distracting them with something that will make them happy, like, I don't know, candy or a toy or something. Or I remember being told as a kid that I was too sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how many people that I work with who identify as having some version of codependency who were told as children that they were too sensitive.
Right.
So, one of the most important things that we get from our primary caregivers, if we're lucky, is we are taught emotional language and our emotions are validated.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't mean if a child is having a temper tantrum because they wanted to stay up for another hour and they can't, that doesn't mean that you give them whatever they want. It means that you can acknowledge how they're feeling and still maintain a boundary for them. And the combination of emotional validation and a boundary create a very secure container for a child who will then grow into an adulthood who's not afraid of emotions, theirs or
Right.
other people's, but who is able to maintain boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So, and to me, that becomes the same thing with self-care,
Right.
with eating habits and exercise and going to doctors regularly and getting enough sleep, all of those pieces that ideally, if we have that containment in childhood, is a little easier for us to do in adulthood, even with social media telling us that we don't look the way we're supposed to.
Right. So we're all neglected on some level, and yet,
Not robots.
mm-hmm. And the goal is good enough parenting. And your overall sense is that many codependents come from a background where knowingly or often unknowingly they were neglected, and it shows up in certain behaviors as they get older, as their life continues.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's a fair assessment.
Okay. And before we talk about social media and conventional beauty, you did share with us previously about an experience of codependency with, this sound like a bad boy who you dated in high school. I remember too, we talked about a song and you would listen. I think you were in a convertible and it was invisible.
That is right. Alison Moyet.
Yeah.
Which,
And
if
you,
anyone knows, that's how old I am.
and this song resonated so much with you, right? And you're like, on some level, that's how I felt in my life. So reflecting on, your young adulthood, or I don't know, any time in your life, a codependent experience or relationship that you can share with us.
Sure. So I'm trying to decide if I want it to be dating or friendship, because it shows up in lots of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the places, since I talked about my penchant for the bad boys in the first one, when I got to college, I became friends with, this was one of my best friends. And this was platonic, but she was like my person. So whenever there was anything going on, she was the one I wanted to talk to. And when I got into my 20s and beyond, she was living in a different state. In fact, we haven't lived in the same state since I think the end of she graduated a year after me. And I think she moved shortly after to go to law school, and law school was in a different state. So we did not live in the same state for, in decades at this point. But whenever I needed to talk to someone, she was the person. And if she wasn't available, I had to sit and suffer on my own, because there was no one else in my mind that I could go to. Now, was that true? 100% no. But in those moments, I would believe that it was her or nobody.
Wow.
And it was really, really painful when I had to sit and kind of suffer with whatever was going on. And it could have been a breakup. It could have been an argument with family, like whatever it was. I would really just sit and be miserable until she was able to return my call, which is crazy if I think about it now. And one of the things that helped me with that was years later, when I was doing a coaching program, because I was a coach before I was a therapist. And I remember this demonstration that this guy, Bill Grout, who is amazing, had done. He had this piece of wood that was like, I don't know, however my hands are, like 18 inches by 18 inches or something. And he had a box of Dixie cups, the little paper cups that I grew up having in my bathroom. And he asked how many Dixie cups it would take for him to be able to put underneath that board, stand on that board, and it to hold his weight. And, people kind of say all kinds of things. And he tried 1 cup and it smashes. And then he tries 1 under each corner and it smashes. And the number he came to was 18. And he said, when you're looking for a support team, and you only have one person, when you're going through it in a big way, you risk crushing them.
Wow.
If you can have a team of people, then you're not going to overwhelm any one person when you're going through a bad time. And that stuck with me, and it made so much sense, because even though she never expressed feeling crushed by it, she may have been in some respects as codependent with me as I was with her. Like that was the experience. Like I was crushed because she wasn't available. And it just made no sense. And so nowadays, like even years later, I still have to remind myself, you have many people on your support team. And I also learned to be able to recognize what people in my life are a really great support for what parts of my life. Some people are fantastic to talk about food and body stuff with. Some people are horrible. And that doesn't mean that I don't want them in my life. It just means that when I'm having a rough body image day, they're not my call. And that's okay.
Right.
So, like that's an example, I know who I can call when I want to talk about business, when I want to talk about being a therapist, when I want to talk about working with people with disordered eating and eating disorders and body image issues, like every aspect of it, whether it's personal or work related. For the most part, I know who are the people in those positions on my support team. So yeah, because I think it's important to remember, even though a lot of people think about codependency in terms of your dating life,
right,
it really, for many, if not most, will show up all over the place. It's just so apparent in dating often.
right. Yeah. No, I definitely had the same friend, the same yearning, the same desperation,
Yeah.
suffering. Yeah, I remember one time, I've talked about this on the show before, but I walked in, my sisters were visiting, they weren't living locally at the time. So I walked into my parents' home, mom, dad, sister are there. I'm on the phone with my person, and I was like, I'm on a call. I'm gonna go wrap this up. Like, here's four people, right? Four Dixie cups. But I really only, yeah, I was so focused on her and those calls.
This is the only person that I feel safe enough to lean into when I don't feel strong enough to stand on my own. And that just shouldn't be only one person for anyone.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. That's a great example.
You
So,
know,
like, how did he come up with that?
the Dixie Cups.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that's profound.
I know. I mean, like it was 20 years ago, maybe, and it is still top of mind. Like I can still picture the entire demonstration.
Wow.
And I've told that story so many times to clients.
Yeah, it's a good story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, who are my Dixie cups? So everyone work on building that team.
And it's a good exercise actually to come up with all the different categories for
Mm,
actual positions in that team.
right.
I mean, for some reason, I always think about it in terms of a baseball team, but like maybe if the first base people are all of the people who are best for dating advice or dating support, and maybe the second base people are career, and the third base people are family, but they're not in your family, if you know what I mean. And so on and so forth. So that, and then the other exercise that I found really helpful is to look at where my strengths are as a support for someone else.
Mm. Where are your strengths? Or can you give us an example?
Yeah, I everything. I'm kidding. Um, so with my friends who are not therapists and who are a little uncomfortable with therapy, I can be a really great career support. I have experience working in the corporate world, and so I I think that is very easy for me. I have a lot of experience, so it's very easy for me to step into that headspace. I think I can be very supportive for people with body image issues in larger bodies, and very supportive for people who are not very diet culture-y in any body. But for my friends who want to talk about weight loss, like I'm not that person for them at all. At all. And sometimes I also struggle with some of my friends in the desperate to find someone space, because I both resonate with that time in my life and am past it and don't want to spend any time there. Like it's painful when I listen to someone who's, really struggling with being single in a way that it's hard for them to enjoy their day to day.
Mhm.
And I would like to, I mean, I can do that with clients, but with friends, it's not where I struggle with it.
Yeah. So you know your strengths.
Mhm.
That's great. Yeah. So the categories or positions in your team, and also where are your strengths as a support, as a team member for someone else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm not great with politics or Twitter.
Okay, so
I can be a TikTok and Instagram supporter, but not in a healthy way, maybe. Anyways.
yeah, that's great. Well, just the clarity, right?
Yes.
So, mhm. All right. Well, let's turn to one of your specialties.
Mhm.
Cori, what are your thoughts on the connection between codependency, food, and body issues?
Okay. So one of the things that I said in earlier today is that I think when someone is emotionally neglected, and oftentimes one of the ways that kids are emotionally abused, that is more subtle, maybe not so subtle, is talk about their bodies. And I don't mean sexualizing them. I mean, you shouldn't eat that. You don't want legs like your father, or like all kinds of little things like that, that maybe abuse seems like a harsh phrase, but the stuff that, I'll have teen clients that will come in and say to me is so cringeworthy. And it's not coming from a harmful or a malicious place. It's like, these are the places the parents are living themselves. So it's natural that that happens. And I think a lot of times kids and then adults will feel that in order to be deserving of love, they need to look a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think because people who struggle with codependence struggle with self-worth, I think it's another tier in the self-worth category of things.
Right.
Am I pretty enough? Am I thin enough? Am I athletic enough? Am I toned enough? Am I muscular enough? It affects men and women and all genders. I mean, non-binary, someone who's transgender, so many body image issues. And so with all of that being said, there's such a connection in how you value yourself and how you see yourself, your body image.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think that's where the connection comes. I also think that people who struggle with codependence will find ways to soothe themselves that sometimes fall under the category of eating disorders. So like if you're growing up in a really chaotic household, let's say with abuse, with addiction, one of the ways you can control your environment is by controlling your food.
Mm-hmm.
People who have emotions that they can't express for a number of reasons. Either it's not safe, there isn't space for it, they feel invalidated when they try. Sometimes they'll use emotional regulation tools that are not really great tools, things like cutting, things like binging and purging, or just binging. And I think that the challenge is that you start out, and oftentimes, weight loss is so put on a pedestal that, parents will start out by saying something to me about their teen that said, well, I mean, at first they were just such a healthy eater, but really what they're telling me is all the restriction they started engaging in.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get complimented for that restriction. You're so good. You eat so healthy.
So disciplined.
So disciplined. And then the eating disorder, it catches, so that for some people, it takes over to a place where, they could end up hospitalized for nutrient deficiency.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to be really skinny for that. I actually know people who were in larger bodies and starving themselves and had to go for medical restoration in a hospital and then into treatment for the eating disorder that was ignored because they weren't thin.
Right.
So I do think often developmental trauma plays such a role in those food and body issues. at the end, the more that it takes on, the more that it kicks in, the less intimacy and connection the person who's dealing with it is going to be available for.
Mm-hmm.
So, it becomes a tool for connection or for control or for some sort of stabilization that actually creates more isolation and pain.
Right. And I'm hearing potentially, for codependence, it's a triple-edged sword, because like you said, there's low self-worth, right? So in order for me to be deserving of love, I need to look a certain way.
Yep.
I'm vulnerable to coming to that conclusion.
Yeah.
And then in this environment, which is out of my control, I might notice how soothing and comforting food is. Yes,
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof. Or it just sounds like two walls start kind of coming in because I'm trying to manipulate my body, and at the same time I'm starving, binging, purging. I'm doing all these things that really impact how my body presents, but I want it to look a certain way.
Yeah. Yes. And it might not impact the way people want it to, but it also impacts the way that your body functions. I think that's what a lot of people don't think about. Mm-hmm. When you're undernourished, your body and your mind don't function optimally. Like, you actually need food to function optimally. Mm-hmm. So, it's hard when you're undernourished to go to school or work and do well. Right. Although I know a lot of people who have struggled with anorexia who have been very high achievers and get really good grades. And still, you sit down and have a conversation with them about what they're doing to their bodies, and they can't see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here the walls are closing in from the side, and I'm hearing this positive feedback from others about how great I look and how disciplined I am. Mm-hmm. But then, the consequences are less intimacy, less connection, which is what I started this whole thing for in the first place.
Yeah. Oftentimes, and I get this on a very personal level, mm-hmm. When I lose weight, then the person that I most want to fall for me will. When I lose weight, then my family will be so proud of me. When I lose weight, then I can live my life more fully because I won't be ashamed of my body. And people get into that rhetoric at every body size. The larger the body, the more weight stigma they experience. So that becomes another whole edge of the sword. But at any body size, when we connect those fantasies to weight loss, they don't long-term work. I always, in my head, I can think of beautiful, thin celebrities who were cheated on and left. And it's like, oh, okay, I guess. But for me, that's going to work. Mm-hmm. No, probably not.
Mm-hmm. And with your specialty of mindful self-compassion, mm-hmm. I'm curious, Cori, can you give us a 101 description of what mindful self-compassion is, and then how you use it in your work with codependency, food, and body issues?
Yeah. So mindful self-compassion or self-compassion. Mindful self-compassion is a program that was created by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. Kristen Neff wrote the book, Mindful Self-Compassion. And then she and Christopher Germer collaborated to create the 8-week class. And the idea of it is to help people become more self-compassionate. And the value of self-compassion, there's been a tremendous amount of research on self-compassion and overall wellness, lower amounts of anxiety and depression, self-compassion and being compassionate towards others. Research shows that people who have more self-compassion are actually more available to be compassionate to others. Self-compassion can be tremendously helpful with body image. And so what I start out with is usually just trying to offer compassion to the person in front of me. And there's something called the mindful self-compassion or the self-compassion break. And it's the 3 steps that are identified in the book and the classes. And so the first step, although there are no particular order, but this way makes sense, is mindfulness versus over-identification. So generally someone will say, you know, I'm a loser, instead of I feel really uncomfortable having made a mistake. And so instead of the I am, it's I feel. And in order to be able to have that mindfulness, like you have to know that you're experiencing pain, because compassion is what comes about with the desire to alleviate suffering. You have to know you're suffering. So that's mindfulness right there. The second part is common humanity. So often when people are having, like if you talk to someone who has depression, they can say that when they're in a really depressive state, they genuinely feel totally alone. But I don't know the numbers, but I bet if we consulted with Dr. Google about the number of people who identify with depression just in our state of California or in the United States or in the West, like I bet that number is staggeringly high.
Yes.
Depression as a mental health issue is pretty common, sadly, but feeling sad, feeling depressed, all those emotions are experienced by every human being sometimes.
Right.
So the second piece of this is common humanity, recognizing that there's nothing wrong with you because you feel some version of suffering, that is just a part of being human and that you're not alone. And then the third part is self-kindness. And with Kristen Neff's latest book, which is called Fierce Compassion or Fierce Self-Compassion, Fierce Compassion, they talk about the compassion in terms of the nurturing, like nurturing mom part of it, or dad could be, I suppose, or parent, but just that nurturing, loving, soothing, it's okay, I've got you. Maybe it's like soothing touch, rubbing your hand on your heart. And then once you've validated that emotion, then you can ask, is there some action that I need to take or that I would like to take as a form of active self-kindness? Maybe it's a boundary.
Right.
You know, I think of a lot of the when people come out and protest for things, a protest is a form of an active compassion, right? You're protesting because you want to alleviate some sort of suffering. So it's acknowledging the pain and then taking some action when necessary. You don't always need to take action. Sometimes the soothing is what all there is. You know, if someone has died and you're sitting with someone in grief, you're not going to set a boundary. You're just kind of going to sit with them and hold them.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you don't want to skip the nurturing part. So
right.
I will offer that to people, and then I will teach that to people. So that when I'm working with someone who, let's say, has had food and body issues and this like desperate pursuit to have an Instagram body, and we'll talk about what is it that you want to get from that. And usually I can eventually get them to come up with the need. And the need is often something like love or connection or safety. And so really honoring that need and the pain of that need not being met.
Mm-hmm.
And then teaching them that when you know what that pain is, when you can identify it, you can name it, then you can move through the steps of reminding yourself you're not alone and offering yourself kindness in the face of it.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea isn't to eliminate the pain, it's to learn how to be with it so that it can move through you and out of you.
Right. So I'm curious, if I were one of your clients and I come in and I'm crying because I just reached my goal weight. I posted a hot girl summer, whatever the hashtag is for 2023. We're old. I don't know what the hashtag is, everyone. But I've posted, and yeah, I was hoping this guy who I have really been into and adored, who's been, I don't know, somewhat flirtatious. I realized that he just posted a couple's picture with some new girl who maybe she has an ideal IG body. And yeah, I come in and I'm crying, right? I met this goal, Cori. I didn't get him. I got all these likes and I feel really empty inside. I think I just need to lose 5 more pounds, right? Or like, what if you know what I mean? Like, I feel like the search is like, let me join like a bikini contest or.
Right. And so I would walk you through what you were hoping to get out of this whole goal that you've been striving for.
Right.
And it's different if you are like fully in an active eating disorder. That might be a little bit different. But I would say, recognizing this all began because you wanted to get the attention of this guy who you get there to your goal and he's found someone else. And, really acknowledging how you emotionally are feeling about that, the pain that you're in, and the need that you were trying to meet, and normalizing how everyone wants to be loved. And it's everyone at some point or another falls for someone who doesn't reciprocate it, and how painful that is. And what is it that you need in the face of that pain? And, we'd walk through different compassion practices. We would walk through looking at your needs and where your needs came from, and how else you could meet the need to feel loved. It might not look like how you wanted it to with this particular person.
Mm-hmm.
That sucks. And it's a grieving process as well. Obviously, it's very complicated,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of work to be done when somebody comes in and has an expectation of how a body size change is going to change their life, and the disappointment when it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
A
grieving process. Sorry, go ahead.
It's like recognizing that you were trying to fill a need in a way that was never going to fill it. You can get someone to be attracted to you with body changes, potentially, not always, because attraction is more than just physical appearance, but they're not going to fall in love with you because of it. And usually the desire isn't just for attraction.
Yeah. And I'm curious, right? I mean, yeah. Oh, where were you, Cori? I think I said this in our last episode too. Where were you when I was 22, 25, right?
There was someone for me when I was 22 and 25. I mean, honestly, I chased that dragon for a while.
Right. So I can sense what it's like sitting with you. I hope the listeners are able to sense that too, right? Like these really profound and reflective questions. What is the need? Right? What did you want? Really taking space for that. And then, yeah, also like hearing you, right, kind of create my inner sense of common humanity, right? I'm human, there's nothing wrong with me. And then, right, the self-kindness. How do you help your clients translate this into a practice of their own outside of therapy?
So oftentimes I feed it into them over time where they can, when they're being hard on themselves. Yeah, I have a hammer. When they're being hard on themselves, yeah, a kind hammer. It's made with a Nerf thing at the end. But you know, they'll say like, I heard your voice, or you know, I know, and then we'll come up with phrases and, you know, constantly be practicing in session. What was the emotion? What do you think the need was? You know, and I like, depending on what's going on for the person, sometimes it's, loving kindness meditation. There's loving kindness phrases. And a loving kindness phrase is something like, may you be happy, may you be healthy. Self-compassion phrase added in there is, may I accept myself as I am. May I know that I'm loved. May I know that I'm worthy. May I treat my body and being with love and respect, would be loving kindness. So when you're talking about just offering well wishes, it's loving kindness. When you're talking about offering alleviating from some sort of suffering, then it would be loving kindness. And so I'll sometimes work with people to come up with their own phrases, and they will usually put them in their phone because that's what everyone does nowadays. But when I first started working with that kind of thing, I actually wrote it in pen on a mirror in my bathroom, so that every morning I was reading, may I treat my body and being with love and respect. So those kinds of practices I think can be really helpful. You know, and if anyone wants to take the mindful self-compassion class, it's amazing. But it really is about integrating that work. It's about learning how to recognize when your inner critic is screaming at you. And I'll help my clients figure out ways to respond, sometimes to the inner critic, other times just to the self. You know, like if I'm hearing myself say I should be thinner, my response might be something along the lines of, sweetheart, you are loved just as you are. Sweetheart, I probably said this the last time. It's my word that I never use for another human being. But when I was taking the mindful self-compassion class, it's a word that when I refer to myself that way, always puts me into a state of self-compassion. It softens me immediately. So finding, you know, what that is for yourself. Right. I've had people tell me it might be like a hand on their cheek. You know, so sometimes it's soothing touch.
Right.
whatever that is, everybody gets to decide what works for them.
Right. Last question, going back to where you sense codependency stems from, right?
Mhm.
Emotional neglect
And abuse, but yeah.
and abuse. And if we, right, you talked about how sometimes we don't know that we were.
Mhm.
And as we grow older, we also are unaware that we also are emotionally neglecting ourselves. So
Mhm.
how have you seen or experienced this, self-compassion within your work or your codependent patients, cultivating self-compassion, a practice? How does that turn into emotional attunement, attention? Yeah. What's the opposite of emotional neglect?
I think like emotional, like EQ, when they talk about emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also psychoeducation that I always do with my clients, that I experienced in all the things that I've mentioned today. And so I think being able to understand what you didn't get and what is so hard for you to give. I so often I talk to people who are conflict avoidant, they're afraid of conflict. And that so often stems from what happened in childhood and a fear of if I make them mad, they'll leave. So I can't be myself because I can't risk that. And I need to be perfect. And perfect is often like what I believed perfect was not expressing who I am and how I feel and what I need. So I feel like for myself and for my clients, it really is about helping them to gain the emotional or the emotional education,
Mm-hmm.
psychoeducation about what they didn't get, often to no fault of their parents, but just because, their parents didn't get it either. And then it's easier to teach someone how to give that to themselves and others.
Right.
And another really great tool for people who are really on this journey with codependence and wanting to find their voice and express how they feel and not shy away from conflict so much is a process group. I'm not running one right now for how often I talk them up, but they're amazing tools. It's some point in the journey for someone who's dealing with codependency in particular,
Mm-hmm.
because it gives you a safe place to practice a whole lot of skills that are so hard for people who struggle with codependence.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Cori, for coming on again. I do remember. I think I've shared this. I don't know, but I'll share. I hopefully I shared it with you. But after we logged off of our first time together, the
Yeah.
podcast was teeny tiny, right? Like I had a couple solo casts. I was doing some interviews, and I logged off, and I thought to myself, if this is podcasting, I can do this forever because I loved our time together.
This was
And
fun.
yeah, I just, codependency, I can talk about it forever. And then, yeah, hearing your specialty. So again, thank you for coming back.
Thanks for having
And
me.
what, if people are curious to learn more about you or get connected with you, what are you offering the listener today?
So I was thinking what might be really fun is to do a free 1 hour intro to mindful self-compassion for codependency. And I don't have it scheduled. So my thought process is that if I get people who are your listeners who would be interested in that, that will come up with a date and do it. And it'll be free on my end. So and it will be centered around self-compassion for codependency.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, I will put Cori's website in the show notes. I encourage you guys to reach out to her via email to inquire about the free 1-hour introduction to mindful self-compassion. And yeah, Cori also has an Instagram. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So again, thank you for being here.
Thank you. This has been fun as always.
Yes. And thank you, dear listener, for listening. And we will see you guys next week. Bye. Hey, girl. It's Marissa again. I'm not like a regular podcaster. I'm a cool podcaster, right? Thank you for listening and staying till the end. You can find me on Instagram at Therapy with Marissa. Email me, marissa@codependummy.com. Check out codependummy.com for more information on the show. And baby girl, a subscribe, rating, and review would be much appreciated. Till next time, I want you to remember, if you are feeling unseen, I see you. If you are feeling unheard, I hear you. And if you think that you don't matter, know that you matter to me. I want you to go out there so you can stop playing small and start taking up space, you dummy. And now, the disclaimer. Girl, this is not therapy and I am not your therapist. This podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regards to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, or guests are rendering any legal, clinical, or other professional service. If you want or need a professional, please find one.